Hello and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to join us for today's webinar. This is Scott Dill with Real Story Group, and our founder, Tony Byrne, will be joining us on the line momentarily to take us through the heart of today's presentation. We've had some great conversations lately in regards to the MarTech stack and omnichannel technology, but today we're going to go back to our roots a little bit and talk about how we really get started when it comes to selecting technology. And with that, we'll focus on how best to select web content management technology and find the right vendor for what it is that you're trying to do. As we get started, there are a couple of housekeeping items of note. If you do have questions throughout the presentation, we will have time at the end to address those. So those can be entered into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. And also for our subscribers on the line, you'll be able to access a recording of today's webinar in your subscriber library. And then for everyone that's in attendance, you'll be receiving a copy of the slides within the next couple of days. So again, thank you for taking some time to join us. Just want to talk a little bit more about Real Story Group and some of the markets we cover. As I mentioned, we got our start covering web content management technology under the title of CMS Watch back in 2001. Since that time, we have evolved, and really we've put all the different markets we cover within this map to give you a convenient look at the different vendors that are out there, how some of them intersect with each other, and how some of them are best in breed solutions. Today, we are going to focus on the blue line, which you'll see goes all the way from left to right. We do evaluate about 35 vendors in that particular space. And I'm going to turn things over to Tony, who's going to take you through how best to select a vendor in that market. Tony?
Yeah, I always like this particular session. It takes us back to our roots. I founded Real Story Group, as Scott said, at CMS Watch, covering back in the day what we called CMS vendors. Our first report in 2001, I think, covered 12 of them. Now we're up to about 36. It's changed a little bit over time, and particularly in the last year or two, seen some really subtle changes in the market that are potentially interesting and useful for you if you're out there looking. I originally founded CMS Watch because of this, what you see on the left here, this idea that there's some kind of a mystical quadrant that's going to tell you who the winners and losers are in this market. Really don't believe in that. We do generate our own quadrants, but more significantly, we let you generate your own quadrants and shortlists using our research, which is, as Scott mentioned, really around not finding the best vendor, but finding the best fit vendor for you. And we decided early on that to do that, we really had to create a different kind of analyst firm that didn't just talk about being independent, but really kind of walk the walk, which meant that we would never consult with vendors, speak at their events, accept hospitality for them, write white papers, get quoted in their press releases. We would be completely hands-off as far as all that was concerned, so we could just focus on you, the actual end user and customer of these technologies, and really be an advocate on your behalf. And I think as a result, you'll find that our evaluation research is some of the toughest that you'll find out there. So let's get into it then. What is going on in the marketplace? And it's a marketplace that has seen constant change, has certainly matured over the years, still highly fragmented. But let's just introduce it from the concept of some kind of key trends that we see going on. So I would say one kind of mega trend that's really transpired over the past, really over the past 4 or 5 years is, trying to reduce system complexity and to explore simpler alternatives to doing things. And this is interesting because many of the systems still do have kind of power user interfaces, but in particular, really trying to simplify the editorial environment. What you see on the left here, WordPress Gutenberg, is kind of an attempt to apply a medium style authoring interface. I think that's emblematic of a more general trend that of more editorial fluidity with a kind of a resumption of the importance of content and content driving the experience. We're also seeing increasingly that ecosystems matter a lot, the ecosystems around these tools. So you do have some new vendors, particularly in the headless space, which I'll talk about in a minute, which are quite interesting. But since they're newer, they don't always have the same kind of developer, customer, partner ecosystems around them. And so that's a little bit of a red flag with respect to long-term viability. As I mentioned, headless and headless architectures, which means a WCM platform that only generates content repository with an API rather than actually delivering your site. Architecturally very elegant, popular in the last 5 years. Also a little bit of a backlash against it for those who want a tighter integration between content experience and those who see their marketing and content managers as also managing experience. So we're seeing a trend towards sort of head optional architectures where a vendor can support both models. To be sure, they're often sort of clumsy one way or the other, depending on where they're coming from. But we think this is the future. And then finally, I think what we're seeing among a lot of you, particularly those of you trying to really think about this from a user-centric or customer-centric standpoint, is really looking at the bigger digital engagement picture around digital asset management, your outbound messaging, social, CRM, and all of your other engagement services in kind of a broader context. And so where does WCM fit in? And sometimes web content management may be more of, although it's a critical foundation investment, maybe more of a subsidiary investment. So we'll talk about the selection implications of that as well. So, there's, even though there are changes, I think definitely there's been some enduring, notions here. One that, curation really matters a lot. So collaboration over formal workflow, curating automated lists, and definitely syndicating micro content and experiences beyond your website. So that's the big promise of the whole headless revolution. We know now that with these complex stacks, integration matters. And as I mentioned, the broader vendor ecosystems are really important, particularly as you hear about acquisitions and other things going on in this space and about long-term viability and being able to find peer support and the right degree of external support. Really the strength of an ecosystem you can really associate, we believe, with the sort of long-term viability of any given solution. And then, this notion that you have a broader digital experience stack. So, we've been doing a lot of thinking around this. This is kind of the stack today that we see a lot. We've got a variety of different digital engagement systems that then work through delivery systems, ideally tapping into some sort of customer data backbone. We're also evolving this model into more of an omni-channel stack, but at the same time, the point that I'm making here, though, is that web content management is really just one piece of the puzzle. And so you really want to think about metering your investment accordingly. And I think even more generally to think about as we move data and content and decisions kind of lower in your stack with CDPs or customer data platforms, journey orchestration engines, which is really the future of personalization, the evolution of digital asset management in more of a headless omni-channel content platform, then you may need less capabilities in your WCM than you might have thought before, that it may become more of an order taker rather than a decision maker. And I think this is important as you go ahead selecting in the future that you may not want to buy as sophisticated and heavyweight a WCM platform as you thought you might have needed for the 2010s. In the 2020s, maybe simpler is going to be better. So if we're talking about simpler versus complex, then this is a good time to take a look at the marketplace as a whole. This is on a complexity spectrum here that we're looking at. By complexity, we're not making value judgments, just that you have on the far left kind of toolkits, which are really more developer-centric platforms, then go into the mid-market and then simpler products. And so the more platform or toolkit-like, it's going to have more native richness and more extensibility, but it's also going to bring more complexity. You're going to need more developers. It's going to have a higher long-term total cost of ownership. So again, not making value judgments here, but just simply suggesting that as you go out and look in the marketplace, you want to kind of understand and map your, the level of complexity that you're looking for and also are really willing to and can capably absorb, relative to the marketplace. So some people kind of put themselves more in the upper range. Some organizations might say, hey, a mid-range solution will suffice for you. We're increasingly seeing that the mid-range is a very popular place to be right now. When you're creating a short list, we typically suggest maybe looking across a couple of different ranges, sort of testing out, what's the level of complexity that we really need and that, as I mentioned, we can really support. The only box here that I would just sort of maybe shy you away from is in the lower left, these legacy systems. These are, for the most part, systems that you leave rather than you license afresh. And so a lot of our work with subscribers is kind of coaching and counseling them through a kind of a breakup there and going to a more modern, more dedicated platform. But it's a highly fragmented marketplace, which is good. But the downside to this, of course, is that you have at some notion, at some case, some level, a lot of choices, and you can have definitely some paralysis here as you look at this, or maybe some vertigo. So we'll talk a little bit about how do you then narrow down all these 36 choices into a short list that you can test against your own use cases. So that takes us then into a selection methodology. How do you go about selecting web content management tool? Well, a lot of people will tend to look at trail wisdom. We made this as kind of a joke, which was comparing different WCM platforms to Game of Thrones characters. Companies do have reputations, they do have histories, they do have cultures. It's important to look at the vendor as well as just the product. On the other hand, just turning to your peers and working more on sometimes trail wisdom can be gossip, doesn't necessarily tell you whether it's going to work right for you and your unique circumstances. So how do you take a more sort of methodical approach to this? A very common approach that we see, and our research somewhat supports this, is this notion of looking at features, or services. So you can take a web content management system that divide the potential services into 3 categories: technology services, content services, and then optionally experience services. And you can look at the tools in terms of what they do in each one of these categories. And to some extent, we do this. Historically, we used to put a lot of emphasis on this. I'll tell you that over time, we found that this approach actually was not as useful and germane as you might have thought in terms of filtering down your choices. It's not that these services are unimportant, but that if you look at them more in isolation, you lose the human component. And also, this doesn't really tell you what kind of a fit it's going to be. For example, if we just look at workflow in the middle column under content lifecycle, there's a lot of different ways to do workflow. Some are more formalistic, some are more collaborative. There's different theoretical models around how to do this. You'll see web content management systems running the whole gamut. And so you can't necessarily say that one workflow system is inherently bad or good. It's a question of, does it fit the kind of nature of the business process and the editorial culture and norms that you have? So it's really more around, that is workflow good or bad? Is there globalization or not? But more how the system works. How does it work? And how is that going to then map to your particular needs and your particular internal process model? So then that begs the question, well, how do you get to the how? And there's a couple things that we look at here. One is usage scenarios and strategic considerations. So usage scenarios are ways that we look at from a business perspective, what does the particular solution emphasize? So for web content and experience management, we've got 10 canonical scenarios. We're just now adding an 11th around portals and dashboards, which remain an important consideration. And again, these are some are more simpler, some are more complex. No value judgments here. My wish for you is to always have more simpler business needs, but it doesn't always work that way. And then this is, by the way, our rankings for OpenText Team Site. And it's a question then is, does the vendor really emphasize this use case or not? And the reality is, although every vendor will say that they can cover every use case or nearly every use case, they're often imprinted by their earlier customers and by their overall model and thinking around this, the problems and the customer bases they're trying to serve. And so we find that a typical vendor is going to excel at 2, 3, at most 4 scenarios and then be okay at a couple more. And so you really want to kind of match up the vendor's focus against your own business priorities. And then on the right is more around strategic considerations. So see that these are some of the intangibles that are really important about the vendor, the product, and the community. And again, there's different circumstances where you may want to emphasize certain ones over certain others and have that make some of your consideration. For example, you may want to insource much of the development, or maybe you want to work with external partners. That's a really critical consideration when you're looking at this. Cost and value is going to be more or less important in certain circumstances. So these are all things to think about as well. And so when we look at, how are we going to build a quadrant, we'll typically say, look, it has to do with business use case fit and strategic fit, and that's how you drive. And so you can try this out on our site. We have a RealQuadrant shortlist generator where you plug in what are your in any marketplace, what are your key business scenarios? What are your key weightings with respect to strategic considerations? And then it generates a custom quadrant that gets you to a short list of vendors where you can be more or less discriminating in how many you want to take a look at, but helps sort of break down all of our research around these 36 vendors into more bite-sized pieces, just to focus on the ones that might be a good fit for you. So still believe in quadrants. They should just be dynamic quadrants, should be a real quadrant that's the right fit for you. So building a short list is obviously just part of the challenge here. You've got a broader task, which is to actually go through a selection process. And so my colleague Jared and I wrote a book on this after watching for nearly 2 decades hundreds of companies go through this effort and really thinking about what was a more agile approach to do this and cherry picking what we thought were some of the best practices that we witnessed or that we participated in. And the idea here really was to apply design thinking, to build a team around this, to have a test-based process where you could iterate and adapt as you learn more and more about the technology, about your needs, and about the vendors. So I'm going to get into that now, but we'll also remind you that we'll have some time at the end for your questions or comments. So I encourage you, if you have anything you agree with, disagree with, want to dive deeper into something you didn't quite understand, feel free to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll have some time to get to that. Okay, so what is design thinking? This is a fairly famous definition from David Kelly, who some people consider kind of the godfather of design thinking. A lot of this is going to be very familiar to you if you've worked through any kind of user-centered projects here. But the key thing here is really, to me, it's really this human-centered approach, right? So rather than having a lot of bloodless sort of feature set requirements and checklist boxes, you take this as a human-centered project, which is to help the humans on your team publish more effective content and websites, and to do so more successfully, and then to create more engaging experiences around that for your visitors. And so these is fundamentally a human-centered activity on both sides of the equation, right? And so we need to treat it like that, and we need a methodology that does that, really around empathy, definition, ideation, prototyping and testing all the way through. And so what does this look like? It really becomes a kind of a filtration process. So you can use, the RealQuadrant shortlist generator to, get down to a short list of ideally 6 to 8 vendors. But before we even do that, you really want to create diverse user stories. And that's really the key is, whether you call these use cases, scenarios, user stories, the important thing is it's human-centered or persona-centric and that they're narrative. Right, so that real human beings can recognize these. These should become the basis for your RFP and for really the whole process. So the next step is more definitional. You create an actual an RFP and send that out to a short list of vendors. The core of that RFP should be user stories. Of course, there's other non-technical considerations you may want to put in. We suggest doing that not as a checklist, but as a series of questions to vendors, in particular how questions. So again, the 2 key pieces of your RFP are narratives, user stories, and then how-oriented questions, all prefaced by some context of the vendor about your current situation and why you're trying to change and what are your overall business objectives. Okay, so those 3 elements really shape an RFP. Many organizations are down on RFPs, sometimes called tenders. That's mostly because they've struggled with them in the past and they haven't put together particularly good RFPs. I think you'll find that a good RFP that has those 3 elements I discussed, the business context, the user stories, and the how questions for the vendors, that you'll find that enormously useful, and the vendor will as well. But now the thing is about your user stories is they're not going to be perfect at first. They're going to be potentially inaccurate, maybe duplicative, maybe things that aren't particularly differentiating. There may be gaps in them. This is normal, particularly at your first take at this. So that's why you want to have an iterative process. So it starts with the RFP and the proposal replies you get from maybe 6 to 8 vendors, and you realize that, hey, I like these 4 vendors, but also I want to change these user stories. So you modify your user stories for the demo round. And that's where you're kind of getting into more ideation mode. It's more of a of a discussion with the vendors during the demos on your use cases about the art of the possible. So ideally, you do that with about 4 vendors, day-long demos, again, primarily oriented on your use cases, and then then after that, filter down to 2. And this is the prototyping or bake-off phase. This is really, really critical. I'm dumbfounded by how many large enterprises never test the technology that they're going to license. It's like watching a car salesperson drive around the parking lot and then deciding you're going to buy the car without actually getting in and trying it out yourself. Definitely want to prototype these. Usually a week-long bake-off can work. A lot more to say about that. But then optionally do a test-based POC where you're testing more integration and security and other critical technical concerns. But because that's pretty labor-intensive on both sides, typically we recommend doing this with a single finalist. You can do it with 2 finalists if it's really mission critical, and you've got the resources and time, but you can also just do it with a single finalist, just more as a confirmation step that there's not any hidden gotchas there. But again, the key thing is put away the Excel spreadsheets, checklists. The vendors have seen them. They can check all the boxes. Instead, you want to create these 2B scenarios with personas, descriptions, objectives, and then a narrative with real people. Hopefully, you already have some skill in doing this. If you're already in a customer experience or digital experience role, you may have done this for your own customers and prospects. You just may never have done it with some of your colleagues actually working on the system. So that's the core. That's the core behind the RFP. That's what the vendor's demoing, and that's what you're testing during the bake-off. But you modify and iterate against those narratives as you get smarter and more aware of what's really going to work well for you during this process. Okay. So some final thoughts here. WCM tools have been growing in complexity, but this is potentially a dark alley in an emerging omnichannel world. You may want to think about having a more simpler tool on the front end as more complexity gets moved to an enterprise level or outside of a specific channel, and more omnichannel data, more omnichannel decisions, more omnichannel assets that then are all feeding your simpler WCM platform. So I think that's one of the key themes is think simpler going forward. Don't default to the most complex tools. So be sure to evaluate the wide swath of plausible alternatives. Again, highly fragmented marketplace. Integration matters, but so does usability, and that's why you need a test-based process. And then make sure you follow an agile approach that I just outlined. And if you do those 3 things, I think it will bode well for your long-term success. Obviously, if there's any way that we can help you, we'd love to do that. Our research is the toughest that you'll find in the market. We've been following these WCM vendors for 18 years. We know them, we know their habits, we know their inclinations, we know what works well, we know what tends not to work well for them. So happy to share a sample with that from our website. And more generally, I think if you are responsible for the broader stack within your enterprise, we'd love to have a conversation with you. We know that you get a lot of questions every day from your peers around different platforms and systems, and our mission in life is to shield you from those questions so that you can think about other things like the nice vegan burger you're going to have at lunch that day. And we really increasingly work with stack owners as kind of like their extra set of eyes and ears, and in a sense, like I say, kind of a shield against the outside world so that they can focus on the things that really matter. And we do that through subscription offerings. Our simplest one is a vendor selection advisory, where you get access to our shortlist tools, all the hard-hitting research in connection with the selection process. Or more generally, if you are a stack owner, we have this omnichannel stack advisory, where you get access to all of our research and a lot of our thinking on strategic decisions, and we're kind of on call to help you at key decision points, and then potentially the opportunity to join this executive council we have for omnichannel stack leaders. Just had our first council meeting last week in Boston. Really exciting. Some great stuff came out of it. Wonderful private discussions, great conversations over great food. And if that's of interest to you, feel free to check in with us. So with that, we'll see what questions have come in. And Scott, if you want to just talk about next steps.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. As Tony mentioned, you're welcome to take a look at the research. You can download a sample from the Web Content Management research right from our website, and along with any of the other markets we cover. You can also try out those decision tools like RealQuadrant and Real Time to get a feel for what it would look like if you were to become a Real Story Group subscriber. And if you'd like even more detailed overview, I'm happy to schedule some time with you and give you that behind the scenes tour of the Real Story Group subscriber experience. We also have a number of on-demand webinars available that you can download. We'll be posting our schedule for Q4 for webinars in the coming days, so please keep an eye out for that. And our blogs are continually being updated with new insights on the various markets we cover, so certainly keep an eye out on that as well. Tony,
Great.
see any questions come through?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things that have come up. One is someone is talking about this rumored Salesforce content management system. This is interesting because Salesforce has taken a couple of runs at this before, and there have been Salesforce partners largely unsuccessful in developing web content management systems on the Force.com platform. Right now, Salesforce has some content management capabilities under its community platform, which is part of their kind of social CRM effort. And so that's really around peer CRM. It allows you to publish some content. It's certainly not an omnibus web content management system that would compete with the likes of the 36 that you see here. Salesforce continually rumored to acquire a CMS, has never pulled the trigger. Not clear that they see it as strategic. I think in their own thinking, it's probably more of an ancillary service. And so they've made significant investments through their venture arm in Bloomreach and WordPress most recently and others. So they're kind of keeping tabs on the market, but I don't expect Salesforce to be a major player. And the other question was around omnichannel and could I clarify more what this whole omnichannel thing means as far as needing a simpler web content management system. Yeah, I went through that kind of quickly. The general idea is that if you want to have coherent customer experiences across channels, and if you really want to have more of a 360 view and orientation towards the customer, then you need to really transition from being channel-centric in the way you deal with them and being more enterprise-wide in the way that you deal with them, and certainly more customer-centric that's channel-neutral. And to do that means extracting services from different channels where they're kind of trapped and making them more enterprise-wide. So some of those services would be customer data, right? So you don't want your customer data bound with your web content management platform, or for that matter, bound with your email platform, right? It should be something that all your different channels can tap into a single source of customer data. The others is around decisioning and next best action and personalization, more broadly journey orchestration. Rather than having personalization within your web content management system, you set up the rules underneath that so that it can be orchestrated properly with customer care, email, social, and everything else. Same thing for some degree of omni-channel reusable content. You don't want to necessarily have your web channel be the place where you have all of your reusable content. So we're seeing an evolution of the WCM Marketplace into omni-channel content management systems where you have core reusable assets that then would feed a web content management system. So all this means is that your web content management system, for lack of a better word, doesn't have to be as intelligent and as robust. It's more of an order taker than a decision maker in the future. And so it definitely does need to be able to integrate with a lot of these back-end systems. So that's a degree of complexity that maybe some of the mid-range solutions haven't quite anticipated as well as we'd like yet. But in terms of loading it down with a number of features, it's definitely going to be lighter. So we sometimes refer to this as having Pilates for your stack, which is to build the core and not the upper body. We have some recorded webinars on that you can go see. But I think the real implication is that if you look at the most complex tiers of the market, where you have like Adobe, Sitecore, Acquia, Tridian, and others, maybe even Episerver, those platforms, we tend to think maybe over-engineered for the next decade. And so if you're looking at them, that's fine, but you should also be looking at simpler alternatives if you're taking a really strategic approach to this. Okay, so I'll get off that soapbox and wish you well for the rest of your week. For Real Story Group, this is Tony Byrne and Scott Dill signing off until next time. Thanks again. Bye now.